It is a sharing between us and them and the physical space of the world around us, the divinity in the world around us, the spiritual powers of the moment of time in which the conjuration is happening, and the spiritual powers that make up that physical place where it's happening.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Ath, and today we're so excited to chat about familiar spirits with magician and author BJ Swain. So what is a familiar spirit exactly? And what's the difference between familiar spirits and other spirits listed in the grimoires? What is this thing called positive spirit possession? Well, BJ Swain is here to take us deep into the world of familiar spirits. BJ's latest tome is Familiar Unto Me, Witches, Sorcerers, and Their Spirit Companions. BJ's also the author of Living Spirits, a guide to magic in a world of spirits, Luminarium, a grimoire on cunning conjuration, and so much more. BJ was also a contributing editor for Heaven and Hell 2018, the grimoire issue, and has had essays published in the devotional anthology for Persephone, Queen of the Sacred Way, and the short story collection Tales of the Darkening Year. BJ also runs the website The Unveiled Key and the blog Glory of the Stars. BJ also hosted the podcast In the Company of Stars and has been practicing magic for about 30 years. In addition to practical work with magic, BJ focused his education on classics, but also took several courses covering magic, the paranormal, mysticism, and mythology as part of his academic studies. He's worked through the AA and a hereditary line of witchcraft and has served as deputy minister of an OTO body, a priest in the Gnostic Catholic Church, and the Bishop of Maryland for the Church of Light and Shadow. BJ's also a former member of the Order of the Celestial Academy and currently works with a small group of magicians who have completed the Abramelin working and who work to spread interest in more traditional magic, and in addition to that is organizing a Dionysian mystery tradition. BJ was also a recipient of the Black Crozier Award. Also thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron supporter on Patreon for your wonderful questions for BJ. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back BJ Swain. BJ Swain, thank you so much for taking the time and stopping on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. You produce such a great show. I was super excited to get to come back.
BJ, the honor's mine. And just, kind of going through your bio there, one thing that sticks out to me is you're not busy at all.
Yeah.
Given that you are constantly working on something, what was the genesis of your latest tome?
So I guess it was towards the end of 2021. I was working on different ideas for next possible book. I had a couple projects that were started that I was well on my way along with, but they were things where I kind of put them back on the shelf and was like, I'll come back to these later, and was looking for something new and interesting to go with that I felt like I could work on as kind of a quicker, shorter project than some of the more involved things I was working on. And it was just everything that I came up with, I would be like, yeah, that's something where I can write about that quickly and easily, and it'll be really interesting, and I'll be able to say something meaningful about it. And I would get started with it, and the idea would start out as this simple idea, and then I would realize, oh, there's all these other things that I should talk about, all these other things that I should address, and then it would start turning into a big research project. And I was like, no, I need to do something that I can get done and be able to say that I finished something. So I ran through a handful of different things. I was working on a text on the concept of the devil and how we use the word devil in English to refer to several different types of spirits and concepts and ideas, and going through exploring all the various different ideas that we use with that term. And then moved on to working on a text on necromancy, which had started off as just sort of exploring a ritual that I performed on the first anniversary of my father's passing. That was kind of after like stepping away from doing much ritual magic for a year. That was like the first big ritual that I did. It was a pretty intense ritual. And so I was writing about that and presenting the ritual and sort of going through some ideas for how to build a necromantic practice. And then that turned into like this deep dive into research in the Greek magical papyri and exploring like research into Greek necromancy. And so I was like, okay, this is a great project, but putting this on the shelf. Started looking at fairy queens, same thing kind of happened. And then eventually I was talking with some friends about our work with the familiar spirit at William Blake Lodge. And we decided to do a panel discussion because there's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of controversy around that. And that controversy turned it into a bigger, more recognized incident than I think it may have been otherwise. But maybe not. People were kind of excited and interested in it before the controversy. And so we did the panel discussion. And as I was doing kind of the intro for the panel discussion, I talked about how I was considering putting together a class on familiars and might consider doing like a pamphlet or a small book on them at some point. And as I was doing that intro, I was like, well, why don't I just write a book on what we did at Blake and kind of write about familiar spirits in general? So I started that and initially wrote a manuscript that was about 100 pages long. And it basically was drawing from my experiences and drawing from what we did at William Blake Lodge and exploring all of that and talking about how to explore those same sorts of things or how to work with familiars in other contexts. And passed it along to my editor. My editor was having some health issues, and so it took a little while to get the manuscript back. And so I moved on to some other projects. And then when I got the manuscript back, I was going through some personal, I guess, kind of mental health stuff and needed to take a break. And when I got through that and started reading the manuscript again, I was like, there's these other elements that I really should talk about. Like I should explore this, I should explore that. And so then that turned into this deep dive into a bunch of research, going through a bunch of folklore collections and academic texts and reading some dissertations and all of that and distilling things out from all of that material in order to add a couple sections to the book. And the book more than doubled in size at that point. But I think it is a good thing that I have this tendency towards taking a project that I think might be a small project in the beginning and then kind of exploding it into a more thorough project, because at least in this case, I think the result was a pretty good result.
We were just chatting before the podcast too, that it's really hard for me, at least, to imagine an issue more fraught with misconceptions than familiar spirits. And you mentioned too that in your latest tome that familiar spirits are underexplored in modern magical literature. So can you just kind of give the listeners the broad strokes about why is it that the, delving the esoteric spade deep, if you will, into familiar spirits is not being done enough? Like why is that?
I think there's kind of a perception that in the beginnings of the occult revival, which I think is kind of a problematic term because it implies a sort of end of Anglophone occultism that doesn't actually exist. But around the creation of the Golden Dawn and the development of the more modern ceremonial magic systems and the advent of neo-paganism, we sort of assumed that magic involving spirits was not part of that, and that it was moving towards this psychological model, moving towards this energy model, and that everything was kind of about archetypes and symbols and Jungian psychology. And there's a truth to that once we get to Crowley and Dion Fortune and Israel Regardie. But when we actually dive into what Mathers and Yates and several other magicians around the original Golden Dawn were doing, there was actually a significant amount of spirit work, and they had a lot of ideas about what spirits were and how spirits worked and how they interacted with them. And that's something that doesn't always come through when we look at that sort of magic, because it didn't continue as much with the later formulations of it. And even with early Wicca, there's a lot of strains of Wicca that draw a lot from the Key of Solomon and from the type of spirit work that's in the Key of Solomon. And so that was present there in the beginning of those systems as well. But as things became more popularized, the initial popular writers that everyone kind of drew from, they moved towards more of this psychological perspective. And there was a kind of desire to make magic feel scientific and feel acceptable to a scientific, rational, materialist worldview. And in doing that, a lot of things had to be kind of excised or explained in ways that kind of toned them down or turned them into things that were just symbols or that were representative of ideas rather than actual experiences or actual spiritual realities that people might engage. And I think the idea of a familiar spirit is something where there's really no room for that if you're cutting the spirit world out of magic, if you're making the spirit world into something that's just a metaphor. There was kind of a point where discussion of those concepts and exploration of those concepts and pursuit of those concepts just wasn't there. And then as you get kind of the next generation of magical authors and neo-pagan authors, they're looking at these stories and these folktales and these images of the witch and the sorcerer that have come down to us through history and which were present in the media, and things like a familiar are present in those images and those ideas. They're part of the icon of the witch or the icon of the sorcerer. But in trying to look at things from a very materialist perspective where there's not a lot of spirit work, then you have to kind of wonder, okay, well, what is a familiar? How does a familiar fit into this? And so you start getting things where people decide it's like, oh, well, these were just pets or these were just animals that these witches or sorcerers had. And people decided they were somehow spirits or devils, or just the fact that they had a pet made them easy to accuse of magic. And so it was really just a misconception because they had these pets. Or you had some people who determined that the familiar was a part of the witch or a part of the sorcerer, or that it was basically some sort of thought form that they built up. And then those ideas all kind of swirled together. And so you have kind of a point in, I guess, by the late 90s, early 2000s, where people are writing about witchcraft and magic, and they do talk a little bit about familiars, but they're mixing a bunch of different ideas from different systems, and the way that they're explaining them combines a lot of these ideas to the point where their explanations become fairly inconsistent because they're taking disparate things and not looking at, well, is there a way to fit these together, or are these actually separate things? Instead, they're just kind of describing the pieces of the disparate things as if it's all one thing without kind of looking at like, well, does this all fit? Does this actually work? And ignoring what the actual history was and what we could actually see in the original material because they were sort of cut off from that. That wasn't the stream of information that had been passed down through practice. So I think it was kind of a combination of this sort of desire to shift magic into something that fit with modernism, and that creating a break in kind of the communication of these ideas, and then trying to go back and reify the idea into something that fit that new worldview or that new approach without it being something that people were doing or practicing or exploring. And so people kind of had to come up with something to give a meaning to this word that they knew was part of the idea of the witch or the sorcerer without actually looking at like, well, maybe the original meanings of the word really are what it means. And maybe this really is what happens.
To that very point, your book goes into detail on different rituals and examples of working with a familiar spirit. But can you just kind of trace out some of the broad strokes of what actually is a familiar spirit? Are there across, cultures and space-time, if you will, are there these core elements or traits, or is there anything that you find in all of the different areas that you researched about what a familiar spirit is?
I think in general, it's a spirit that you have a close, personal, ongoing relationship with. We could say it's a spirit that you're kind of bros with, but that's going to depend on the nature of the relationship. Sometimes it'll be one that is a very friendly equals type of relationship. Sometimes it'll be one where the spirit is maybe more of a tutelary spirit and kind of teaches and guides you a little bit. Or it could be one where the spirit is in more of a subservient position and is there to kind of serve and assist you. I think a lot of times it's going to be something that's a combination of those things, where there can be that kind of personal familiarity, that connection, sort of an intimacy or friendship between the magician and the spirit, as well as the spirit having the capability to give guidance and information and education and introduce new forms and approaches of magic to the magician, but also a sort of instrumental relationship in which the spirit can go out and perform things and do things for the magician. But what differentiates it from other spirit work is, with other spirit work, you're calling upon a spirit that many people may be working with and asking it to do things and sort of negotiating things on frequently kind of a transactional basis. Whereas with the familiar, there's an established relationship of mutual aid where you're going to do certain things or provide certain things for the familiar is going to do certain things and provide certain things for you. And generally it resides with you or stays with you or is in kind of a state of being nearby or in ongoing contact where you're able to basically just turn to it or speak to it and it'll be around in order to do the things that you need. We kind of talk about conjuring spirits formally and then getting their private number to put on your speed dial and contact them more simply in the future. And that's an important part of developing spirit work. The familiar is kind of a step beyond that, where instead of saying like, hey, is there like a special name or special sign that I can call you with quickly without using the whole ritual, you're saying, hey, do you have a spirit from your legion that can come and live with me? And it can do things for me instead of me calling you up to them. So I think that's kind of the most general concept of the familiar, is it's a spirit that you know well and work closely with, and frequently it resides around you, and you have an ongoing mutual relationship with that spirit.
And of course, BJ, we have several listener questions for you to that very point. And you just traced out part of this. And I think this next question from podcast patron Daryl takes that a little bit further. Daryl is asking and saying, hi, BJ. I'm so stoked you're back on Glitch Bottle. Daryl, so am I. Very stoked. My question is this. Daryl says, I am a Solomonic magician, and I work with the Lemegetans Goetia. Many spirits in the Lemegetans say they, quote, give good familiars, unquote, to the magician as part of their office. What, BJ, in your estimation, makes a familiar good, quote unquote? And then Daryl says, as a follow-up, are there specific parameters or expectations that you have when working with a familiar spirit? Thank you, Daryl.
I guess there's a couple parts there. I think in terms of what makes a familiar good, I'm assuming in the grimoires when they say that, what they mean is that the spirit in question has spirits within their legion who are amenable to working with people and interacting with people and will fulfill requests accurately and answer questions honestly without a need for a lot of coercion or restriction. I think in that case, we're probably looking at good in a context that is relative specifically to or juxtaposed to the assumptions about what working with a demon are like in that grimoire context. Frequently, there's the expectation that the magician has to ligate the demon so that it appears in a way that is amenable or not terrifying, that it doesn't produce foul stenches that will make the magician sick, that it doesn't lie to the magician or trick the magician or use phantasms to pretend to be something other than what it is. And so I think when the grimoires talk about giving good familiars, they're kind of saying, okay, this is a spirit who's going to give you a spirit that's not going to do any of that nonsense. It's going to work with you and work with you fine. I think we can kind of take a step beyond that when we're thinking about the idea of what makes a good familiar and moving beyond just that kind of context of like, okay, what does this mean juxtaposed to what we might expect with grimoire spirits in that context of thinking about them based on the way that the writers of the grimoires thought about them. A good familiar would be one who has some ability to comprehend human needs, is able to follow directions without perverting the direction or the instruction. It's not going to go and perform some task that you ask it to do and perform the task in the most chaotic or destructive way possible. It's going to perform the task in a way that's actually useful and good. It's going to be good at going out and obtaining information or obtaining things the magician needs. It's not going to throw tantrums when the magician is maybe distracted and not as on top of the magician's end of things as the magician should be. It's basically a spirit that is going to be able to get along and do the work well without creating problematic elements. I think that's what we're kind of looking at when we're thinking about what a good familiar is. I think another element of that can also be looking at what are you looking for a familiar for. Sometimes we might get familiar spirits that are for particular ranges of tasks. You might go to a spirit of a particular nature and ask for a familiar that will specifically work on things that are related to what that spirit that you're getting the familiar from does. So say if you call upon a Jupiterian spirit and you ask it for a familiar because you want prosperity and fecundity in your life, then a good spirit in that case is one that is kind of consistently working on developing those things and bringing those forces into your life in useful ways that are going to be manifest in material and actually help you, regardless of whether or not you're asking for something specific. I think that's one way to look at what a good familiar is when we're looking at it from the perspective of, okay, I need a familiar for this particular type of thing. Another way to look at it may also be looking at what types of spirits we're asking for familiars from. Some spirits may be better at one type of work or another type of work based on the type of spirit they are. So whether we're going to a fairy queen to get a fairy familiar or to a demon to get one of its legions or one of the Olympic spirits or another angel, or going to Hecate to get one of the restless dead. There's lots of different ways we can go about getting familiars that are going to be spirits of different types, and those spirits might have different types of usefulness or things that they're more specially able to do. And there may be things that they're not as able to do based on their nature or the type of spirit they are. And so I think that's another way of looking at kind of what we might mean by a good familiar, is looking at, is this the type of spirit that's going to be a good fit for your type of work and for your comfort levels and for the type of experience that you want to have in dealing with the spirit world. Now that obviously steps outside of what is meant in the grimoires when they say, what's a good familiar? Because the grimoires aren't really thinking about like, oh, well, you could be asking all these different types of spirits. They're just kind of looking at, hey, you've got a demon and we're looking in this sort of adversarial exorcist context for working with demons. So you want a familiar that is not going to be adversarial. I think that's kind of what the grimoires are getting at, but I think we can look at it beyond just what the grimoires say there. And as far as like particular parameters or expectations, I think the big expectation is just that it's someone who's going to be around and who's going to answer when you call or when you ask for something, and it's going to be attentive and maybe recognize that human lives sometimes have demands that cause us to not pay attention to all the details of every area of our life, and that it's not going to be a spirit where if you're usually doing weekly offerings, if you miss a week because life goes crazy, that it's going to start tearing stuff up and going crazy. It's going to recognize like, okay, well, that just happens and you're going to make it up later. I think those are the kind of things where you have sort of the expectations that I would have in looking for a familiar, that it's going to be a spirit that will get along well, that will help out in the ways that I want it to help out. And it's not going to be particularly picky or demanding in ways that make the relationship difficult.
BJ, that's so excellent. Would it be safe to say that, to Daryl's question, and then just kind of broadly speaking, as you touched on, that all of the things that habitually magicians or operators in, say, the classic Solomonic context are worried about. This spirit will potentially lie to me. I must successfully bind the spirit. As you said, I have to give habitual ritual offerings, or things might go sideways. When I ask for something or issue a charge, it needs to be in the most legalistically precise language. All of those potentially problematic areas, or areas that might require a significant amount of, is this okay? Am I doing this correctly? What you're saying is that when it comes to the familiar spirit, because of the nature of the relationship itself, broadly speaking, you don't necessarily have to worry about those things, because it's just a completely different relationship compared to a spirit that you are, say, contacting for the first time in a grimoire.
Yes, definitely. I think some of that can be approached from the perspective of when you make the initial contract, it's defining the elements of that relationship. And so that kind of act of ligation is there in the initial contract, if you're sort of looking at it from the perspective of that needs to be there somewhere. It could also be something where you look at it from the perspective that because you're building this relationship of mutual aid, it's going to be a relationship that isn't approached from that same perspective, that there has to be this kind of adversarial binding element to it. The spirit is definitely bound to you, but it's not necessarily something where it has to be viewed in this, I'm binding this dangerous monster so that I can interact with the dangerous monster safely. I'm not saying throw those concepts out entirely, because spirits can be dangerous, spirits can be antagonistic, spirits can also just be creatures that understand the world and existence in a way that's very, very foreign to the way that we understand it and experience it. And all of those things can create situations where there is a need for caution and there is a need for care. But I think in a familiar spirit relationship, that kind of caution and care is very different from the kind that might be recommended if you are just conjuring a demon for the first time.
Your book also, as well, BJ, touches on the concept of familiar spirits, as you've intimated, in pagan and neo-pagan contexts. Can you share a little bit more about how familiar spirits are perceived and worked with in these contexts for people who may not be too familiar with it?
First, for listeners, because this approach of dividing pagan and neo-pagan is something that you'll see in some areas of the community, but not consistently. When I refer to pagan, I'm generally referring to the portion of the broad umbrella that is dealing with either revivals or reconstructions or attempts that are inspired more directly by historical pagan religious practice. And neo-paganism is more of your 20th century, inspired by New Thought, inspired by the Golden Dawn, inspired by Theosophy movements that grew out of Wicca and the kind of festival communities of the 60s and 70s. There are very different approaches to spirits and to gods and to ritual in those two different environments. And I think when we look at the idea of familiars in those environments, generally we're probably going to find people who are looking more at fairies and at the dead and at nature spirits or spirits of animals, as opposed to looking at demons and angels for the source of familiars. You could also have individuals who look at approaching a god and receiving one of the daimones who works underneath that god as kind of a lieutenant for the god. That would be a very traditional way to approach things as well. I think that when we kind of look at things in those contexts, in a more traditional pagan context, it's not always looked at as a familiar or sort of spelled out or something that a lot of people explore. A lot of that community doesn't really focus on magic and is more focused on religious devotion or community religious practice. But there are still people who engage in magical practices under that aegis or kind of work with spirits in that context. And so I think probably the most common thing you would find as far as something that's relatively traditional would be either something along the lines of asking a god for one of the spirits that serves under it, or looking at some sort of relationship with a nature spirit or a household spirit or one of the fair folk. And that's something where if we look at mythology and we look at folklore, we can find lots of examples of relationships with the fair folk and relationships with spirits that are nature spirits or household spirits that echo elements of the familiar spirit relationship and are similar to the familiar spirit relationship, but maybe aren't exactly the same thing. When we look in a neo-pagan context, that becomes a little more complicated because we have an array of very modern, very new ideas, and it has become very common to use the word familiar to refer to one's pet or to an animal that there is a spiritual bond with, even though that's really very removed from what the word familiar originally means and kind of what the actuality of the familiar is in witchcraft and magic. You'll also see instances where people kind of talk about it in terms of created spirits like servitors, or they will look at certain concepts from folklore and kind of blend those with the idea of the familiar spirit. And so the way that it's perceived or worked with in those contexts typically today can be very broad and ranging. And I think one of my goals with Familiar Unto Me, where initially I didn't really address the neo-pagan context in it, but then realized that that's a large portion of people that are out there. And this is a concept that would still be very much of interest to people there. And so providing them with a way to approach this idea from sort of a traditional perspective within kind of the new methods and new ideologies that are part of neo-paganism could be important. From my perspective there, I think if you look at the types of ritual work that you tend to see in Wicca and neo-pagan witchcraft and kind of general neo-pagan magic systems outside of the witchcraft or the Wicca context, then they are generally not just egalitarian in the sense that anyone can kind of practice them, anyone can be the leader in a ritual there. They're egalitarian in the way that they view the world. And so while there are some basic protections involved in those practices, they're not necessarily ones that are as built up as in some other systems. And there's not as much of a mechanism or technology in place for going out and working with a spirit in a way that's going to have any sort of binding element or ligation of the spirit or anything that puts proper controls or protections in place. There's not really systems of setting up pacts in that context. If you kind of look at the context in kind of like some of the 70s and 80s publishing, where there was a little bit more witchcraft publishing that had a bit more of an edge to it, then yeah, you do see that there. You do see some stuff where there was some early witchcraft publishing based on the Grimoire Verum and some of the material that was published in A.E. Waite's Book of Ceremonial Magic and kind of drew on some of those ritual components in a witchcraft context. But it's definitely not the broad standard of neo-paganism today. And so what I recommend in Familiar Unto Me is looking at spirits that are going to be a little more friendly, a little more amenable, and that are going to be able to be approached in the context of neo-pagan ritual without having to add significant elements from the grimoires or from other more traditional systems that might have more rigorous approaches to engaging or manipulating the spirit world. And so the example that I give is looking at the spirits of deceased animals or deceased pets, because those are going to be spirits that are already sort of used to human interaction and used to being around humans. And so they will be a little more amenable and a little more friendly, but they may also be a little more limited in some ways than some of the other spirit options, but they're a good, safe option for that particular context.
Speaking of specific examples, we do have a listener question that follows your point from podcast patron Katarina, who is asking and saying, "Yay, BJ, love your work. So I was reading that your book presents an early modern ritual for encountering a fairy queen. I'm familiar with the Book of Oberon and fairy operations." And Katarina is asking, BJ, is this early modern ritual similar to other grimoiric and historical treatments of fairies? Thank you, BJ.
Before I jump into answering that, to your point about kind of broadly looking at things and then delving into the specifics, I think that's something that has been missing in a lot of magical writing for a long time, and we're starting to see more authors do that. But I think an important part of that is recognizing that all the things we're talking about are real, that the world is real regardless of how we think about the world, and it exists regardless of how we think about it. And so that reality isn't going to change because we're part of a different tradition or approach. The tradition or approach just means that we're going to approach that reality differently and engage that reality differently. I think once we kind of look at things from that perspective, then it becomes really interesting to be able to look at how these different systems approach things and the diversity of ways that we can deal with the same reality without having to come up with a new paradigm or a new way of thinking for everything we want to look at. And I think in looking at kind of the historical treatment of fairies, that's something where we definitely engage that and see that, because there's so many broad and changing ideas of fairies throughout history and through into the modern era. Morgan Daimler has, I think, recently written about this, released a book that talks specifically about modern fairy beliefs, which often come from fantasy literature and gaming literature, which have influence not just from historical folklore and fairy mythology, but also from kind of your Victorian era twee, pixie, insect sprite type of fairies that are very different from what we see when we look back at older folklore. And it's something where a lot of researchers have looked at kind of that process of going from the traditional fairy to the modern fairy. And when people look at that, a lot of times they overlook the fact that there is a rich history of grimoire work with fairies. There is a fairy witchcraft forum on Facebook, which Morgan Daimler runs. It's a great forum, but what I found is a lot of people there are very familiar with the contemporary iterations of fairy faith and fairy witchcraft, and there's a lot of people very familiar with historical folklore and kind of the mythological renderings, but there's not as deep of an exploration of the grimoire period. And it's kind of interesting because when we're looking back at these myths that were recorded in the late medieval, early modern period, possibly in books that were going from materials from a couple hundred years earlier that we don't have access to now, and are maybe recording even earlier beliefs that were oral beliefs, we're looking at things where we don't have the practices that people were necessarily doing. We just kind of have these stories, and these stories are stories that we understand are filtered a little bit because of their context. And they're also pretty old. When we look at some of the modern stuff, then we're looking at things where people are trying to pull back from those older sources and then kind of look at them with what we know of the folklore that continued and folklore that was kind of recorded in the 19th century. And we skip over the fact that there's this period where we can look at things from about the 15th century on through into the 19th century, where you have active magical practitioners who are writing down books of what their practices are and are drawing on other books that they had access to, drawing on oral traditions that were present at the time. And they're less removed from all of that than we are. And they're presenting their understanding of these fairy beings and their methods of working with these fairy beings. And it's very different from what we would look at in a pagan context or a folklore context, because it's very much Christian ritual magic, and the magical approaches are very similar to binding and conjuring demons, but they're still worthwhile in looking at kind of structures of how people thought of what fairies could do and how you could approach a fairy and what the relationship between the human and the fairy could be in certain magical contexts. And I think it's a piece where we might need the other pieces as well to get a full understanding of how to work with fairies, but this is a piece that shouldn't be ignored either. For the question more specifically with the Book of Oberon fairy operations and the ritual that's presented in Familiar Unto Me, the ritual that I present, and there's actually a couple points where it talks about rituals for fairies, but one that's presented is from the Cambridge Book of Magic. It's a ritual for conjuring Sibylla, who is a popular fairy queen that appears in several grimoires. And yeah, it's somewhat similar to what you see in other grimoire sources. I think it's a little more streamlined than what's in the Book of Oberon. The conjurations in the Book of Oberon are very long and are kind of like if you wanted something that was like taking the concept of a grimoire conjuration and being like, we're going to put this on steroids and just put as much as we can into this. That's the feeling I get reading the Book of Oberon conjurations. I'm just kind of like, wow, you're just going to beat the spirit over the head with this, aren't you? So this is a little less like that. And one thing that I think is really interesting in the Cambridge book example is that the powers that are used to call the fairy are a little different. So it calls the fairy by the fairy sisters, which is something that we see in some of the other fairy conjurations as well. The ritual uses a child scryer. It calls upon women saints who were virgin saints and calls upon their virginity specifically to consecrate the virgin child as the seer. There's a lot of elements that I think are very much of interest with the specifics of this conjuration. I think that it definitely fits within the general character of grimoire fairy conjurations, but is a little bit of a simpler one. If you look in some of the cunning folk books that have been published, like Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet and Angels, Spirits, and Demons, maybe by Daniel Harms, there are examples of conjurations that are kind of like the Book of Oberon conjuration. I think some people have said that there's a shared influence there. They have that kind of formal grimoire structure, but I believe also are, well, in some cases, there's, I think one of the cunning folk ones, it takes several days and you have to go through and conjure all these different things for the different materia that you're putting together for it. But they're still, again, a little more streamlined than what the Book of Oberon shows.
One of the topics that you touch on is something called positive spirit possession, which I really appreciate that term. Can you share with us about what is positive spirit possession and what are some of those misconceptions about, possession, quote unquote, that maybe people have out there that you'd like to relieve them of?
I think a lot of people in the European and American worlds, to get away from that term, the Western world, because it's such an inaccurate term, or a lot of people in the Anglosphere specifically, our concept of possession is either rooted in the concept of possession in Catholicism or in the concept of possession in Protestant Christianity. Protestant Christianity's ideas of possession are weird. They kind of feel a little like Scientology sometimes. Like the idea that you are afflicted with the demon of alcoholism or you're afflicted with the demon of lust. And it's basically that your negative traits or behaviors or emotions are the devil working through you, and that it's not necessarily that you're in actual spiritual conflict with a specific entity that is possessing you and controlling you, but that you're falling under the influence of negative spiritual powers that are bringing out the vices that are naturally in you, or that these vices are expressions of these negative spiritual powers that you're allowing to influence your life. And I mean, there is an argument that kind of fits within the concept of vexing spirits that appears historically, the idea that illness can be caused by the influence of spirits. But it also runs into that area where people kind of look at it as like, well, maybe I behaved badly, but, maybe it's just the devil made me do it. In Catholicism, you have more of your horror religious action movie setup where you have an actual being that is an actual personified spirit, and it's going to come and take root inside your soul and your body and convince you to give it permission to take the lead, and it will kind of take over things that you're doing. And the general perception that I think a lot of people have of that is that the idea is that the spirit is fully in control and that you don't necessarily know what's happening. And it eventually gets to the point where the spirit's just kind of rocking your body as a suit that it's wearing, and it's going about doing its things. And you're just there in terror in the back seat, watching all the things that are being done in your life by the spirit. And the complexities of possession in a negative form of possession that occur in Catholicism and in other spirit traditions that have that, it's a lot more nuanced than that. It can be a thing where it's like working with a spirit, and a spirit is there and it talks to you and it influences you or it inspires you, and you have a choice to listen to what it's telling you or to learn or be guided by it. But that relationship can also become a closer one where the spirit is sort of partially in control and you're partially in control, and you become sort of the negotiated space or the nexus point for interaction between you and the spirit. And there's sort of a blurring of the decision making and the actions and the use of the spirit's powers and what's going on. And then it can move into that state of being a more full control where you're kind of in the back seat and you may have some awareness or may not have some awareness, but the spirit's pretty much taking the lead. You kind of have the Jesus take the wheel moment, except that it's a demon. So that more complex, nuanced idea of possession is one that we see in a lot of spirit traditions. But in a lot of these spirit traditions, it's something that people are actively choosing to do. And it's not necessarily a demon. It might be a god or an ancestor or a nature spirit or all sorts of different types of spirits, depending on what the spiritology of that culture is. That spirit might come and give the person advice on how the community can deal with problems. It might give advice on how to heal some sort of sickness that someone's experiencing. And sickness in that context is not necessarily they've got the sniffles. Sickness could be they are habitually sad. Sickness could be they are habitually poor. It could be that they can't get their crops to grow. It can be that they're not able to find a job that is suited to them. Sickness is any sort of lacking, any sort of thing where you don't have the things that you need in order to be fulfilled or to live your life as best as possible. And the medicine or the healing for that sickness can come in many different forms. And so it may be that a spirit who is a possessing spirit is a spirit that is routinely close with and near the practitioner and is able to speak with them and sort of whisper to them and inspire them. And so the client comes and talks with the practitioner, and the practitioner is able to get an answer from the spirit because the spirit's there hearing what the practitioner is hearing. It could also be that the practitioner takes on the spirit, and the spirit and the practitioner work together to act. And so the practitioner is able to channel the powers and the capabilities of the spirit, or the spirit's able to manipulate what the practitioner is doing, and they're able to affect some influence on the person who is seeking their aid. And then in other instances, it may be that the spirit is fully in control. You could have instances where the cause of the problem is some vexation or some spirit that is afflicting the person, or there could be some damage to that person's spiritual body, and the spirit entity that's the possessing spirit is able to see and perceive that and intervene through the interaction through the practitioner who has the possessing spirit. And this is something that is common throughout the world. We often talk about how forms of shamanism are kind of the baseline early human religion, and that's can be a problematic or contentious statement because we don't really know what people were doing in prehistory. We just know that these forms of religion are things that we see throughout the world, and we see them in cultures that at one point in time, Europeans and Americans would have called these cultures primitive. And so the assumption was, well, if this is what these primitive cultures do as their religion and their magic, then this must be a continuation of the earliest forms of magic and religion. And I think we very much need to move away from that assumption and just sort of look at these are things that exist in these cultures because these cultures have not had their relationship with the spirit world and the natural world interrupted in the same way. And so they still continue their access to this and still continue their practice with, along these lines, but that doesn't make it primitive or backwards, and it doesn't make it something that we can't learn from. I think that for modern practitioners looking at these ways of engaging the spirit world, there are a lot of benefits to them that we don't see in other modes of engaging the spirit world that are still more common in Anglosphere magic or in European derived magic, where we tend to keep a little bit more arm's length with our spirit interactions. But even in those contexts where we kind of tend to think of things as being a little more at arm's length, there's still a lot of evidence that these forms of positive possession, that we have a history of that. We have something where that has been a part of our culture and our spiritual heritage. And sometimes it's still present and we just don't think of it in those terms. And other times there's echoes of it that are still present. And we can kind of trace back along those echoes and begin putting the pieces back together by looking at what occurs in other cultures where this is still a common practice. And so when we talk about positive spirit possession, positive not in a sense of applying something with negative as taking something away, but also not necessarily positive or negative in the sense of good or evil, more so positive in the sense that we are actively making a choice. We are actively seeking out this interaction with this spirit in this way. Even that concept of actively seeking can be a nuanced concept, because there are traditions in which it may be that some people are just more prone to this. And so they might be at events or celebrations where this type of thing happens. And so it's more prone to happening to them, as opposed to something where they're actually engaging in specific ritual actions to cause it or force it to happen in themselves. But there are also traditions that involve that and methods that involve that, which we can draw from and learn from as well. So it's positive in the sense that we are making some sort of choice, or we are choosing to be open to the possibility of this, and then using it in a way that is beneficial for ourselves, for our community, for the spirits that we're working with. Whereas negative possession is something where we are somewhat coerced, even if we are somewhat giving permission or somewhat allowing access, but we're not intending to create that relationship. And because it is a relationship where we don't have as much agency, it's a relationship that potentially can be less healthy or potentially less directed towards the benefit of ourselves or the benefit of our community, and is more for the benefit just of the spirit that's kind of initiating that relationship. I think that's something where recognizing that that still is a form of the possession relationship and experience is something that may be a little at odds with how some people look at magic and look at the spirit world, because a lot of us want it to be shiny, happy rainbows and sunshine, but the world simply is not that. And so there are definitely going to be instances where there are spirits that we can have these positive engagements with, where we're choosing and actively approaching the spirits in order to create this. And it's going to be good and useful. And those spirits can run a wide range of natures. They can be spirits that we might think of as potentially negative, potentially antagonistic, potentially difficult, potentially chaotic spirits, if we have the right skills and approaches in order to engage them through that method safely. They can also be spirits that are spirits that we think of as cool spirits, or spirits that tend to be beneficial or tend to be harmonious. And it's a little, I'm not going to say simpler, and it's not necessarily, it's still not something that is safe in the sense that nothing could go wrong, or there couldn't be problems, or there couldn't be impacts, or there couldn't be changes that result in it. We still have to approach it with care and with respect. But there are spirits that we would assume an amenable relationship or an amenable interaction when approaching them that way. But a lot of it is about the agency and about our ability to work with the spirits and have agency in that working with the spirits through this method, in order to make it something that's mutually beneficial. But that also leaves the fact that there are still powers and forces and entities in the world that are not necessarily naturally harmonious, or are not necessarily only acting or interacting with humans on the basis of us choosing to interact and having our interests at heart. They have their own agendas. They have things that they want to create, things that they want to do, and we can be a vessel through which that can occur. And so the world as a diverse, living, pulsing entity filled with a wide range of pieces, and those pieces all having their own natures, means that we have a world where we can engage things intentionally, regardless of what they're not necessarily regardless, but with consideration of a broad range of natures. But there are also going to be things that it may be better not to engage, or things that there could be engagements that we are less in control of and are not necessarily as positive or beneficial for us. But I think the common misconception is that all possession is in that negative or antagonistic sense, or a sense where there's no agency on the part of the possessed. And I think that somewhat the word possession kind of implies that, because it suggests an objectification or a subservience, that we belong to the thing that is the possessing thing. Whereas really, possession is more appropriately thought of as being proximal. A possessing spirit is a spirit that is near to us and that has an intimate way of communicating with us on potentially an ongoing basis. And so it's very related to the concept of the familiar. For people who are familiar with kind of modern pop culture, Death Note is a great example of possessing spirit. The Shinigami in Death Note basically have a relationship with the people who have the notebooks that is like what a possessing spirit relationship is. It's a situation in which the people who have the notebooks have agency. They're choosing to have this interaction. They're choosing to use it for their own benefit, maybe not necessarily for the benefit of the community. I'm trying to think if there's another common example that kind of illustrates that. And I think it's hard to find one because, again, in kind of the Anglosphere and in sort of European culture, our view of possession tends to be very influenced by Christianity. And so we don't have a lot of examples that show those kinds of spirit relationships. But you can look at most parts of the world and find examples of that. There was a really great article a few years ago, and if you look on the Facebook page for my blog, Glory of the Stars, you'd have to go back a few years in the posts, but you'd be able to find it. There's an article about African culture where there is a person who receives a serpent spirit, and they go to a tree, and the spirit descends and sits on their head and communicates and acts through them while sitting on their head. And the article was a relatively mainstream article, but it was such a great description of what that kind of possessing spirit relationship is like. It was so worthwhile looking at. But you can find a lot of that in mainstream writing as well, where there's this interest in what other cultures do that is growing. And there's some really great explorations of how these spirit relationships exist in other cultures, and how professionals or dedicated individuals are able to kind of utilize and communicate this information or this power from these spirits, because they have this ongoing intimate relationship where kind of the lines are blurred between them and the spirit.
I think I join this next listener, Casper A., who has a question for you about your excellent ability to really, differentiate, talk about the similarities and differences with various spiritual engagements and relationships. The question from Casper A. is, what's the difference, Casper's asking, BJ, if anything, between having a familiar spirit and having a spirit that you regularly work with, having a familiar versus being familiar, if you will? Is there work that's better suited to one mode or the other?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And honestly, for folks that are listening who haven't read the book, there's like a whole chapter that's pretty lengthy that goes in depth into different types of spirit relationships and what the benefits of different types of relationships are, what the difficulties of different types of relationships are, and how you might consider your particular needs or the particular goal in mind for deciding which type of relationship to approach, and how all of these different types of relationships are things that are useful to have present within the life of a magician. I think it is important to recognize that when we say familiar spirit, we're basically it's any type of spirit, but it's a spirit that's familiar to us. And that can be confusing because familiar is a pretty basic word. It's not some weird occult jargony word. It just means someone that you know closely and recognize well and have kind of an ongoing interaction with, clearly related to the word family. So you're going to have spirits that you're familiar with because you work with them regularly, but they're not your familiar spirit. And I think one way to kind of look at that again is that a spirit you're familiar with because you work with it regularly, a lot of magicians will work with that spirit. Whereas a spirit that's assigned to you as a familiar is frequently going to be a spirit that's just assigned to you. And I've seen some magicians who they're a little less familiar with the concept of familiar spirits. And so they kind of assume like, oh, I really like this spirit that I read about in this grimoire, or I really like this particular angel. I guess that's my familiar because I'm going to call them a lot. And it's not. Like, the familiar is usually going to be a spirit that works for one of those spirits, and it's assigned then to work for you. And so it's going to be a particular spirit that is particularly working with you. Whether those spirits are pre-existing or whether they're created by the spirit that gives it in order to be given to you is something that could be debated and could be an element of different spiritologies that people develop from interacting and talking with spirits. There have been some hints in different directions as to how that works. But what I think is important to consider there is that if, say, for instance, the Archangel Raphael is a spirit that I've conjured many times, both in public conjurations for groups as well as in my own private work. So I've had times where in working with Raphael, there will be more particular signs of the arrival, or there will be kind of more consistent things that go along with things that just happen in life around doing that work. And he's also a spirit where I don't necessarily have to go through a whole large conjuration in order to interact with him. I can say a simple prayer and call upon him and ask for help with something. And there may be times where there's something more major where I might want a bigger ritual because I want to create more of an access point for the effect or for the communication of information. But a lot of times that's not necessary because it's a spirit that I've worked with on a regular basis. But that doesn't make him my familiar spirit, and the interaction is not the same as what the interaction with a familiar spirit would be. If I am working with a familiar, then it may be I get out of bed and turn to the altar in my room and talk to the familiar. And there's no conjuration, there's no ritual, there's no prayer for the spirit to be sent, because the spirit has a house that's right there that it's residing in. While it might not be the totality of the spirit is present in that location at all times, there's some piece of it that's present. And so I'm able to go and interact right there and talk with it without having to take a bunch of steps in order to create that interaction. In some relationships, it may be that the familiar sort of follows you, that it is a spirit that is with you and kind of goes along with you and is there. And so you can simply talk to it and interact with it without having to do anything special. Or it might be that the spirit is tied to a particular piece of jewelry or a particular tool, and you simply have to hold that or wear that or use that, and that can initiate the conversation or the interaction with the spirit. Sometimes you might still interact with familiars in a larger ritual context because it helps you create a point where the spirit is more easily able to interact in the world and where you're more easily able to perceive and interact with the spirit world. And so there's a utility to that, but it's not something that is necessary most of the time, and definitely not all of the time. And so even when we have spirits where we kind of work with them regularly and might develop kind of a familiarity where we're able to easily contact them and easily interact with them, it's even more streamlined with a familiar spirit. And sometimes it's significantly more intimate with a familiar spirit. And so there's more of that ongoing kind of bordering on that proximal possessing nature to the interaction. It is a very significantly different relationship, but it's very easily confusing just because of the terminology. Because, yeah, we could say like, oh, yeah, I'm very familiar with the angel Sachiel. Like I started out conjuring Sachiel and have conjured Sachiel a bunch of times, and so I'm very familiar with Sachiel. but that's not the same as having a familiar spirit. It's a very different relationship. As far as work that's better suited to one or the other, I think different magicians are going to have different perspectives on that, and some of that's also going to depend on the nature of the spirit. So if you have a spirit that is of a particular type, and so it's good for a particular type of work, then yeah, you might have to conjure a spirit more formally for other work that's not really as suited to that spirit's wheelhouse. You also get things where like you have spirits that can still do a broad range of things, and depending on the nature of the familiar, the nature of the interaction and how you're caring for the familiar can work very powerfully in the world and can accomplish a lot of things for you. So there'll be a lot of things where, yeah, just turning to your familiar is going to be an easy solution on those things. And it might be that becomes your more routine magical working method as opposed to conjuring other spirits regularly, because you have this spirit that kind of works with you and does things. And that's kind of the point of developing that sort of relationship. But you might also have things where it's a bigger goal, or it's a goal that might be better suited to someone who specializes in that goal. It's kind of like you can call your friend to help you move some furniture around your house, and they're going to be capable of doing that, and they're going to be happy to do it. And you buy a pizza and a 6-pack of beer and share it with them, and they're happy. But maybe you buy a new house and you have a big chunk of money to spend on decorating that house. Your buddy might not be great at interior design, and so you hire a designer who is able to tell you what color schemes to use and what type of furniture to get and where to place it and how to build the flow of things in your house. It really depends on what you need and the specifics. So I guess I find familiars very convenient for a lot of day-to-day stuff, and they still are useful to incorporate into your bigger stuff, even if you're working with other spirits on the bigger stuff, which anyone who's kind of worked with a spirit court is familiar with that you're going to turn to your ancestors, or you're going to turn to your saints, or you're going to turn to your group of spirits that you routinely deal with. And you're going to be like, hey, this is something that I've got going on in my life, and I need this to be what happens with it, and I want your help with that. But you might also conjure a particular spirit who specializes in that and ask it to contribute to it. And then you might go to kind of the spirit that is your first spirit, your introducing spirit, your intermediary spirit, your spirit that kind of coordinates things for you. And that can be different in different traditions or approaches. And tell that, hey, like I've got like the overall spirit court kind of looking at this. I've got this spirit that I've conjured for this, and this spirit that I've conjured for this element of this. And I need these things all to work out this way, in this way that's going to be amenable to me in my life. And you're going to be familiar with that. And like the ancestral spirits are going to be familiar with how things work for people. But this demon that I conjured, it's going to be good at this, but it's not going to have the familiarity with my specific needs or with what human experience is like. And this angel that I conjured, it's going to be kind of like intense about like, it should be done this way. But some of that might not be the best, but it's going to be able to bring this to the table that's really good. Spirit that is kind of like the key touch point spirit, that's kind of like the organizer, the friend that you turn to, who kind of is able to kind of coordinate all of these pieces. You go to that spirit and you're like, hey, kind of guide how they all work and make sure that they're all working together, and that this is all coming out the way that it needs to come out. And so your familiars can be kind of part of that as well. But I think like they can be great for a lot of things that are sort of the stuff that like you just need something right then and there, that is kind of a small momentary thing or daily life thing. Like I had recently where I was searching all over the place for an item that I needed, and I'd gone through like the whole building. I looked in like my place where I store all of them. I looked in a couple other places where they get stored, and I'm just like, I have no idea where this is, and I need it right now. And so I called on my familiar spirit for help with it, and then kind of got this sort of like whisper, like, look here. And I'm like, I looked there like 3 times, and then I look and it's right there. And or I had another time where I needed an answer for something, and it was a very important issue that was kind of time sensitive, and I woke up early to like look to see if I'd gotten a response about it, and was going to be reaching out about it if I didn't have the information that I needed. And so I decided before I reached out that I would ask my familiars to step in and go acquire the things that needed to be acquired, and make sure things were done the way they needed to be done, because I wasn't sure that I was getting the answer that I wanted even once I reached out and got the answer. And so I decided I would check my email one more time before I made a phone call about it after I talked to my familiar. And when I checked my email, there was an email with the answer that I needed, and it was the answer that I wanted. And that email was apparently in my inbox 45 minutes prior to that, even though I had checked and there were no emails. So I kind of turned to my familiar. I'm like, hey, like I really need this. Go take your talons and grab onto these people and make them give me the answer that I need on this. And I go and look, and the answer's there when I had already looked and the answer hadn't been there. And so for stuff like that, where it's things that are kind of right there in the thick of your life, they are also right there in the thick of your life. And so they're good to turn to for stuff like that. But maybe if you're looking at the bigger pieces and all the moving parts of a situation, sometimes then maybe you want to look at more of a specific conjuration for a specific spirit, or a handful of specific spirits that are kind of specialized in the overarching thing that you're dealing with. And then your familiar might take care of specific parts within that.
We do also have another listener question for you from patron Mika Nichols. And Mika is saying and asking, is there a difference, BJ, between a familiar spirit and the HGA, the Holy Guardian Angel? If so, what kinds of things would a familiar be more useful for than the Holy Guardian Angel, and vice versa?
Yeah, they're pretty different. So I think there's a Catholic prayer in the Raccolta, which is a collection of prayers that are traditional, going back a couple centuries, and they are indulgence prayers. And so that means that using the prayers in that collection can provide certain indulgences or certain blessings for you. There's one in there for the guardian angel, and it calls upon the angel to be a teacher and a guide and to lead you through life. And sometimes you get some magicians who are kind of like, oh, the holy guardian angel, it's this special thing that only exists in Abermelon, and it has nothing to do with anything else anywhere else, and it's this own unique concept. And that's really weird, because like if it's this major concept that's like so powerful and so important, why would only one book ever have talked about it? When we look at cunning folk notebooks and grimoires, and even I think even in the Book of Oberon and a handful of other sources, we see lots of prayers and lots of rituals for acquiring the good angel or acquiring the guardian angel. And when it describes what that angel does, it's basically the same as the holy guardian angel. And when we really distill down what the holy guardian angel does, it's kind of the same as the traditional Catholic guardian angel. It's just kind of amped up for magicians a little bit. And so I think when we look at it from that perspective, it becomes pretty clear that the holy guardian angel, it's there to kind of protect you and look out for you. But largely it's there to teach and guide and facilitate. And when we look at what Abraham says about the holy guardian angel in Abermelon, it's not really so much that we're calling on the holy guardian angel and asking it to do a lot of things for us. Like there are some things that it notes that you can ask the holy guardian angel to do. I think there's a couple of squares that like are primarily done by the holy guardian angel. But mostly the holy guardian angel in the context of Abermelon is teaching you and kind of giving you the access to use the sacred magic, which is essentially a way of working with demonic powers to accomplish things, and some other kind of folk magic-y things, and some other good spirits as well. But basically the angel is a facilitator. And so it's able to go and acquire these spirits that you need to work with. It's able to kind of marshal the spirits to do the things that you need them to do. It's able to help you understand and interpret the spirits and have the sight to see and to interact with the spirits. It kind of illuminates you in that way. and then provides you guidance in working with them and how to work with them and how to live your life in a way that is going to work out best for you, and how incorporating that magical work fits with living your life in that way. And so it's not necessarily like a personal god or like a genie or something like that, where it's like, okay, I've got this holy guardian angel, now I can wish for stuff like in a dark song. It's just wonky. Nothing to do with it. So yeah, so that's pretty different than what a familiar does. Now, a familiar might still teach you, but when we look at like a familiar teaching you, like if we look at like Bessie Dunlop, who's a Scottish cunning woman or a Scottish witch. Cunning folk and witches, not exactly the same thing, but sometimes looking at these historical accounts, it can be hard to determine which the person actually is. And so Dunlop gets kind of treated as both. She was tried as a witch, but she had a familiar who taught her how to heal people. And so people would come to her with like their ailments and come to her with their problems, and the familiar would tell her what remedies to use or what magic to do, and would help facilitate that for her. And so in that way, there is kind of a similarity with the Holy Guardian Angel, that the Holy Guardian Angel could teach you and give you answers in those situations and help you figure out what magic links to do. But the familiar teaching you is a little bit more like the familiar is like, okay, this is how you do witchcraft, or this is how you like talk to these fairies over there, or this is how you like kind of hang out with and talk with these demons and get them to do things. Whereas the Holy Guardian Angel is more like, okay, this is how you be the person that you're trying to be and how you live your life. And we're going to work with these demons, but you don't necessarily have to go through these crazy ritual magic steps. I can go get them for you since you have bound them and I've helped you bind them. And they're going to do what we ask them to do because I'm here standing with you as you're asking. And so the Holy Guardian Angel is a little bit like having your own personal thwarting angel. But I think the thwarting angel idea has been given a bad rap because it's kind of, people take it very literally along the lines of Testament of Solomon, that it's like the demons are terrified of these particular angels, and these angels are going to come and lay the smack down on the demons if the demons don't do what they're being told to do, or just because they're demons and angels want to lay smackdowns on demons. I think instead you can kind of look at the thwarting angel more along the lines of a facilitating angel, that it is an angel that's related to the powers that the demons are related to, and they are part of creating the environment in which we can interact with the demons. And there is an element of they can step in and they can provide guidance, they can provide influence, they can execute a use of force if needed, but that's not the primary reason that they're being called or the primary function that they're going to have in that interaction. And I think that's kind of the same as the Holy Guardian Angel. The Holy Guardian Angel is an intermediary. It's a teacher, but it's also a legate. Like, it can go out and carry a message to other spirits, or coordinate the efforts of other spirits, or bring other spirits to work with you. Your familiar can kind of do some of those things, but that's not usually the primary function of the familiar. And you could maybe ask your Holy Guardian Angel to provide some things or do some tasks for you, but that's not the primary function of your Holy Guardian Angel. And so there's some places where you could have some overlap, but it's like you could take the claw on a claw hammer and maybe like use it to wind a screw in place if you seat it just right in the slot on the screw, but it's not really what the claw hammer is for. And you have a better time using a screw or using a drill or electric screwdriver or something doing that than you would trying to use a hammer as a makeshift way of using a screwdriver. So there's some related elements that these spirits have. There's some similarities they have. And the relationship can be similar. The Holy Guardian Angel relationship, that's one where there's always a relationship there. Whether you are actively utilizing or experiencing or aware of that relationship or not, there is a relationship there. Like, you are the earth and it is the moon, and you kind of orbit together. But you have to get into a space where the sphere of the earth and the sphere of the moon are kind of combined, and you are aware of that constant interplay and constant exchange, and you begin to orbit each other instead of just one orbiting the other. And that's kind of what knowledge and conversation is coming into that space where there's an interrelationship and of the interaction, as opposed to just the guardian angel is there guarding you. You're kind of now they're orbiting each other, interacting with each other, moving through each other's spheres. And so it becomes that possessing spirit relationship where it sits with you and it's always proximal to you. And it's like it's kind of jacked in the back of your neck and can kind of like talk into your being and your awareness when it needs to, or when you need it to, when you can kind of just talk to it when you need to. And it's there to be the angel on your shoulder and be your guide. The familiar spirit relationship can be similar to that. It can be a possessing spirit relationship also. It doesn't have to be. But knowledge and conversation is that possessing spirit relationship with the Holy Guardian Angel.
To follow this theme, actually, of breaking those misconceptions and the different spirit categories, we also have a listener question for you, BJ, from Nictophile. And Nictophile is asking and saying, can a servitor, BJ, become something akin to a familiar? And are familiar spirits beginner friendly?
I think the kind of a cool thing with this question is that it's taking the approach that the servitor and the familiar are different, which they are. And I think sometimes people conflate the ideas because that's been a way that people have explained the idea of familiar within the context of, okay, what do we have in modern magic that looks like this? And the servitor can kind of look like that. Yeah, totally. The servitor can be something akin to a familiar. I think a lot of times when people make servitors and when people are kind of being honest about what they're doing and what their servitors are like, servitors are kind of rudimentary frequently. They're not big developed entities that have a lot of nuance and independence. They kind of reflect their creator and are essentially a kind of a reification or an instrumentalization of a particular desire or goal within the creator, and that is expressed outward to become a functional acting force. But it's still basically the power of the person creating it that's doing that. There are ways to make servitors that are more nuanced and more complex and have more independence. Actually, the Order of the Celestial Academy used a method and didn't really call them servitors, but where they would work through kind of Kabbalistic capacitances of the different phases of the tree as opposed to the individual spheres, and work with that with an angel, and then kind of grounding that in the power of an elemental, and then sort of building a spirit using those powers under the direction of the magician. So that's something where it's not just the magician's powers, it's not just the magician's awareness and ideas and will and desire that are creating this spirit. You've got a bunch of different pieces that are going into creating it. Jason Miller has written about the idea of sort of building servitors, and that those servitors kind of almost become like a vessel or vehicle that's constructed, but then spirits that exist in the world and are kind of the small spirits that aren't mapped in grimoires or mythology or the things that we're aware of. They're kind of just sort of like the little ones that are kind of there and about and sort of expressing their natures in the ways that they can. They notice these servitors as they're built, and when a servitor sort of fits their nature, they might inhabit it as a way that's sort of mutually beneficial for them to grow and be fed through the work with the servitor, and then for them to facilitate and empower the servitor doing what it's created to do. And so there's ways that you can kind of draw on other things outside of yourself in the creation of servitor. And as I say that, I realize that might be really weird for some listeners to hear me describing that, because it's just like, most people are probably like, whoa, why would BJ have like complex thoughts on a method from chaos magic? Because it's just not the sort of thing I normally talk about. But it's an interesting area of magic that can be useful. And it's one that I have experimented with. For me, I have found that drawing on powers of places where the servitor is going to act, or powers in the natural world, are ways to feed the servitor so that it can create more of an autonomy and an ability to act in ways that are not fully based on the thinking or the behaviors of the magician, because it has energy elements to its nature which are not coming from the magician at that point. So there's ways that you can create more complex servitors And when you start creating those more complex servitors, then you can start building them such that they deal with a range of actions as opposed to dealing with a particular goal. Because the kind of like prime pure approach to the servitor frequently early on was that it was a particular magical goal that was being accomplished by this magical child that was created by the magician. And it was sort of a temporary spirit to go do the thing that the magician wanted, which is kind of like the way that angels work in some elements of angelology, that God creates an angel for an individual particular purpose. So like when the angels go to Sodom and Gomorrah, there's more than one of them, because like one has to deliver this part of the message, one has to do the destruction, one has to deliver this other part of the message, because they each have a function that they're there for. And they do that function, and then they return to heaven, and then God returns them to the heavenly fire from which he creates the angels, and then he makes new angels to go do the things that he needs them to do. But it's always one particular thing. But then you have the other angels that have names and have an ongoing existence, and they deal with a range of things. And so you can build complex servitors that are like that. And if you have one that's like that, and you're not sort of releasing it out into the wild to go and work with anyone and everyone who has its name and seal, if it's something that's still particular to you, where you're feeding it on a regular basis, and you maybe create a spirit house in order to give some more materiality and form to it, and you're sending it out to go do specific things for you on a regular basis, then yeah, the relationship becomes very much like the relationship with a familiar. I think you probably wouldn't have the same sort of possessing relationship that's potential with a familiar, but again, that possessing relationship isn't necessary for the interaction with a familiar. It's just a way in which you can develop the relationship. I don't see that as being a common thing with servitors, because they are still not quite as developed as an actual like spirit that has come into existence through other means. Typically, you could have ones that are very close to what a regular spirit is, if there's a lot of different elements going into how it's created, and it's being created from multiple different things, and if there's a very nuanced and skilled approach to creating it. But I think there'd be some specific differences in kind of the flavor of what the interaction would be like and what the relationship would be like. But from a utility perspective, they could be very, very similar. I think I would lean into the idea that you probably get more mileage from working with a familiar in terms of its capabilities. But that's just, again, based on kind of the assumptions of what the average servitor creation is going to be like. If you come up with a really, really good method for creating a servitor, you basically are creating something that is pretty similar to a regular spirit. Maybe it would be able to do just as many things.
BJ, I really appreciate that, as you say, that practical advice and parsing that out. And you mentioned a few moments ago too, experimenting with different forms of magic and really seeing and kind of gauging how familiar spirits are approached in those traditions. And to that point, we have another listener question for you from Vajra Magnet. And Vajra is asking and saying, BJ, what aspects of magic do familiars have the greatest impact on? If you can give a specific example of the impact a familiar has had on your magic for a particular ritual, it may help illuminate this question better.
This question sort of, as far as like what aspect of magic do they have the greatest impact on, it kind of feels like it's asking from the perspective of like, okay, the particular thing in your ritual, or the particular approach to magic that you're using, how do the familiars like address that or touch on that, as opposed to necessarily how does the familiar act or what does it do? And I guess part of how I'm interpreting the question, it seems like it's kind of setting the familiar up as this thing that's kind of like outside of the rest of your work, as opposed to something that's integrated in with the rest of your work. And I think generally it's going to be something that's integrated in. And so really what you'd be looking at is either what particular types of things would you want your familiar to do, or you might be looking at, if you are working with an array of spirits or an array of approaches, how does the familiar work within that array of things? And I think in terms of what is it going to do, we've kind of already talked about that a little bit. It could do all sorts of things. Like it could be used for all sorts of different types of magical purposes. And that's going to be directed somewhat from the type of familiar that you acquire. As far as how does the familiar work into your magic, again, there's lots of different ways that you could work that. If you like working from that kind of spirit channel approach that kind of deals with the sort of positive possession angle, then it could be that you open yourself to the spirit working through you, and then you engage in spell work or witchcraft or folk magic, and the spirit's power is kind of moving through you to empower the acts that you're doing for that purpose. It could also be that you simply make an offering to the familiar and empower it to work within the world and ask it to do something along the lines of more conventional spirit work. There's lots of different ways that you could interact with the familiar based on your own personal approach. For me, it's always tended to be more of the I ask the familiar to go and do something, or I ask the familiar to go and acquire something, or to go and take something away. And so it's generally I'm making a request, and then I'm doing whatever it is that I've agreed to do for the care of that familiar. But it's kind of the familiar is sent out to go do things, or sent out to go acquire things, or sent out to chase away things. But that doesn't have to be the way in which one works with the familiar. It could be that the familiar is there to help empower you to do things. It could be that the familiar is there to work alongside you. It could be that the familiar is there to help interact with other types of spirits that are related to the type of spirit the familiar is. Or it could be that the familiar is there largely to teach you how to perform these types of magical tasks, or how to work with these particular types of spirits. I know that can kind of feel like a non-answer because it's saying there's lots of options, but that gets back to that idea of the reality of things, is that if we have this world where spirits are real and spirits have communities and interactions and they connect to our cultures, then it's like interacting with other people, where there's lots of different ways in which those interactions can play out, and ways in which those interactions can happen even with the same spirit, just like with the same person, depending on the context or depending on what we're trying to do. Those different things could play out or work differently. I guess with the familiar at William Blake Lodge, since it's asked for specific examples, a lot of the work with that spirit was just whenever we had lodge functions, we would do the elements that we offered in care for the spirit. So we would provide it with its special incense offerings, and it had a particular blend of incense that was made for it particularly. We would give it its offerings of alcohol, its offerings of candle light or fire. And we had a member who would make small blood offerings to it routinely. So most of our work with the spirit was not going up and like asking for stuff, or like trying to talk to it or interact with it in a more discreet kind of, all right, I'm going to ask you questions and you're going to tell me things kind of way. It was simply, we had a shrine for it. It received offerings and respect and honor at its shrine. Everyone knew that the shrine was there and knew that it was in a central place in the space. And it had a poster up with its seal and its name and images related to the powers connected to it. And so it had kind of like a place of honor where it was immediately recognizable when people came in that, like, here's a spot where there's a shrine and there's some spirit cultists going on. And this spirit is sort of not necessarily receiving like a devotional treatment, but the treatment was kind of similar to like what you'd have in a devotional treatment or kind of a spirit cult. And as a result, the spirit just did its work. And so on an ongoing basis, it would do things in order to kind of create the environment that we wanted in the lodge, bring people in, like make events successful and things like that. So we didn't have to go to it and say like, each time, this is what we want you to do. It was at the outset of the relationship, these are what your jobs are. And this is what we're going to do for you while you live here and you're doing these jobs. Now, we could have had times where there may have been more specific things that we needed or something handled in a particular way, and we could have gone and worked with it in that regard also on top of it. But because the nature of the relationship was based on the relationship with the group as opposed to an individual with the individual's needs, then it kind of had that particular flavor or shape to it. And I think that's one of the things that I kind of talk about in the book is with groups, how familiars can be part of how we look at the idea of developing spirit cultists for groups and developing like kind of a patron spirit for a group that guides and helps that group. And the group does things for that spirit as kind of a patron for that group, which I think is a really interesting way to explore how magical groups can work. On a more individual basis, for me with familiars, it's tended to be, like I said, like I might need something accomplished, or I might want something kept away, or I might want something brought in. And so I ask the familiar to go out and acquire that, or go out and do that, or go out and bring that back, or go out and find whatever that thing is and chase it off. So again, it depends kind of on what the specifics of the relationship are and what your specific needs are as far as what kind of elements they will have an impact on. But I think there's also going to be instances where a familiar might have something where it can't really have the impact that you need. And so it might tell you what else can. I have a friend who she asked a familiar about doing something. I don't remember what the thing was. And the familiar's like, oh, I can't do that, but this guy, he can do that. So conjure this spirit and it'll take care of that for you. And she conjured that spirit and it was able to do what she needed it to do. So there's going to be some things where it just might not be in your familiar's power or something that the familiar is familiar with how to do. But it might know who is or whose power it is within, and it can guide you in that way.
I think this leads actually, BJ, into another listener question, again from Vajra Magnet, who is asking, what do you do, BJ, when a familiar seems to go quiet?
It depends. So you have some familiars where depending on why it's gone quiet or like what's happening in the relationship, it may just be done. So sometimes things just move on. And often that will be because of lack of attention from the magician, or because the magician hasn't fulfilled their end of things. And so it may be that the familiar kind of waits around and looks to see if things are going to start back up, or it might kind of poke at stuff to be like, okay, hey, I'm still here. I can do this for you. Are you going to do your part? And then eventually the relationship just kind of fizzles out or dissolves because relationships have to be maintained. One of the things from growing up in Catholic school that really stuck with me is the idea that sin is the thing that destroys relationships. And so when we talk about sinning against someone, we're talking about doing something that harms the relationship with that person. And that is essentially the core basis of what it is for something to be a sin. And from that perspective, it kind of takes away the idea that particular actions are sinful, and more that the nature of how that action shapes our relationship with someone else. Does that action harm a relationship? Does that action improve a relationship? Then that tells us whether the action is good or bad. When we start to look at that, we can also look at how relationships, there is sort of a thread or a wave. There's something that is a palpable, understandable nature of a link between the people in the relationship. And that can be robust and thick and healthy and consistent and brings the people together, sticks the people together, and makes that relationship enduring and that relationship healthy and reciprocal. Or it can be patchy. It can have points where it frays, points where it thins, points where it gets more quiet, points where it doesn't remain as active in tying the people together. You can move through those points and you can kind of reweave that thread or rewind that thread so that it becomes stronger or it pulls closer. But if you don't do anything about that fraying, eventually it will unwind and dissolve. We see that in our relationships with people in our families, with our friends, and in our spiritual lives. And so that's something that can happen in relationships where we have an ongoing interaction with a god or a spirit or a saint, It can also happen in something where we have a more formal, defined, pacted relationship with the familiar. Now, depending on the nature of that pacting, it may have elements of it that kind of imply an endurance so that the relationship can be picked back up. There could also be elements where, just based on the nature of the spirit, it may be open to you picking the relationship back up if you've kind of let it dwindle or die out. And I think in that case, sometimes it's just a matter of taking special measures to make more offerings, to engage ritually with the spirit, to do things to kind of rekindle that connection, just like you would in a regular relationship with another human that is kind of failing. Like if you have a friend or a partner where things are getting strained, then you spend more time with them. You go out to places that are special. You remind them of things that are meaningful between the two of you. And so it's kind of the same thing with a familiar spirit in that case. There are also some instances where you might not have a lot that you have to do on your end of the relationship because of the nature of the pact. And I think a lot of modern practitioners don't like the idea of approaching spirits as servants or spirits in a subservient fashion, but there are relationships that are like that. And in that case, sometimes it's just a matter of telling the spirit, get your freaking act together and do what you're supposed to do because you're bound by this pact. And so if it kind of has gotten used to you providing a certain level of care and then that drops off, or maybe you haven't used the relationship for a while, you haven't turned to the spirit to do things for you for a while or acknowledged the spirit, then maybe it kind of goes quiet because they do want your attention. Frequently, it's not going to be the same sort of thing where, like with other spirits that work with wide ranges of people, where they like the social attention of being thanked publicly or having statues or seals placed out prominently where it brings them to mind of other people so that other people turn to them and make offerings or interact with them as well. Familiars usually aren't looking for that, but they want your attention. They want your interaction. And so if you aren't being attentive or you aren't interacting or you aren't turning to them regularly for things, then they might just be like, well, I don't have to pay attention. I can kind of just go off and do my thing. If the nature of the pact is like that you have given certain things up front and you have provided certain things up front, and that's the bulk of what you need to do to have that relationship, then in that case, it may just be that you're like, you take the physical pact that you have and you're like, look, you still need to do the things that I request because this is what our relationship is. Most people, I think, are not usually going to enter into a relationship that way. They're going to enter into one where it's like the spirit's doing things on an ongoing basis, you're doing things on an ongoing basis. And so then it is going to be more like that, rebuilding the friendship, rebuilding the partnership through engaging in ritual actions, engaging in offerings, engaging in things that kind of make that holistic attention there again, as opposed to just demanding that the relationship come back into being. But there will also be instances where, because of the way the relationship is pacted or the way the relationship was initiated, that if one or both sides of it kind of starts to dwindle or fizzle in the attention they're giving to it or doing their part of it, that it could just dissolve. And then at that point, there really isn't any making them not go quiet anymore. They just kind of can go off and do their thing. And you could try conjuring them in a more formal fashion, then see if you could restart the relationship, or conjure the spirit that you packed the relationship with originally and see if you can restart the relationship. But it won't necessarily be the case.
I think I joined the listeners, BJ, in just really loving and appreciating those points that you shared about the importance of giving attention. It's so critical. And also, as you said, the nature of the pact or the agreement that one has with the familiar and the nuance that you're illustrating there, BJ. And you touched on this earlier as well, but if there's anything you'd like to expand on, we also have a listener question for you that follows your point from Michael J. And Michael is asking, in what contexts does one acquire a familiar? And I'm differentiating this between commonly known tulkas or self-created entities by the magician.
The context can differ depending upon the approach to magic you're taking. And when I initially announced the title of the book, Familiar Unto Me, which is Sorcerers and Their Spirit Companions, I think it was Raimondo Bukes who asked about if there was a difference between witches and sorcerers and what that difference is and if that matters as far as familiars go. So the book unwinds that significantly and actually provides separate chapters based on like what it is in creating this relationship from the perspective of a sorcerer and what it is in creating this relationship from the perspective of a witch. And there are numerous other approaches that people can take, which would adjust the context of the ritual specifics or who would be contacted, how they'd be contacted in terms of establishing this relationship. From kind of a witching perspective, the witch inherently and innately has power that differentiates them from other humans and makes them sort of quasi-supernatural to begin with. And so frequently that will come with an awareness of the spirit world and an awareness of spirits. And you'll find a lot of witches as children have access to spirits that teach them things and teach them magic and guide them in magic even before they formally begin exploring it. And that obviously the caveat there that when I'm using the word witch, I'm using it in an historical sense of kind of the historical idea of what a witch is, which is a little significantly different than kind of the modern sense where witch is just sort of synonymous with magician. A sorcerer is frequently someone who receives power, and they might receive spirit relationships as part of receiving that power. They could also be someone who cultivates power through engaging in whatever magical practices have particular utility and particular availability to them. So where that creates a difference in the context for a witch and a sorcerer is that because the witch naturally has interactions with spirits, they might have a spirit approach them, or they might be engaged in spirit interactions, and the beginning of their path as a witch more formally might involve receiving a familiar that will help teach them and help perform magical acts for them. Whereas for a sorcerer or a learned magician, along the lines of what we think of when we think of the grimoires, or we think of Agrippa or Paracelsus, then those magicians might spend time studying things and exploring things and conjuring spirits, and then eventually build up to the point of asking a spirit for a familiar. And it might be something that comes at a midpoint in their career as a magician as opposed to the starting point of their career as a magician. But then you could also have other contextual differences. Like in the book, I talk about how from a neo-pagan perspective, it might seem easier to access this kind of spirit interaction through journey work or through exploring things on a spirit reality, something similar to what a lot of people would refer to as the astral plane, as opposed to from the perspective of conjuring. And so that could be a perspective in which you go out through journey work into the spaces where the spirits reside and acquire a familiar sort of on their turf instead of conjuring one, or instead of going to a place where spirits appear or gather and encountering one, acquiring one there. So there's different contexts based on the approach to magic one is utilizing, or based on the relationship with magic that someone naturally has or doesn't have innately. And so there's lots of different contexts in which it could happen, but I would say the most general is that you're usually meeting a spirit and there's some relationship created with that spirit, and that spirit gives you a spirit to work with you as a familiar. And the specifics of what the nature of that relationship is will depend, again, upon you and upon the spirit giving the spirit to you and the spirit that's being given to you. And so, again, it could be one that's more like a teacher. It could be one that's more like a friend. It could be one that's more like a servant. It could be some combination or something that moves between those three phases. It'll depend a little bit on various factors. And those factors aren't all about you as the magician, but you as the magician are still a factor involved in that. So yeah, there's several different contexts, but that's kind of the basic element that is there linking those contexts together. Is typically it is you're meeting a spirit, and that spirit is providing you with a spirit that is underneath that main spirit in some way to kind of go and stay with you and work with you. There are instances where we see stories in history where the magician encounters the spirit that's going to be their familiar and arranges the relationship directly with that spirit, as opposed to being given the spirit by another spirit, but that is less common. One example that tends to come to mind for me with that is, again, Bessie Dunlop, where she encountered the spirit that became her familiar while she was crying and sad because her husband and her child, and I think her cow, were all sick and potentially dying. But even in that case, the spirit said that the fairy queen commanded it to go to her and become her familiar. So while she didn't go and have an interaction with the fairy queen, at least not in the account that survives, the spirit was still compelled by a spirit that was had some power over it, which is a typical part of the context.
Speaking of, as you just touched on a few moments ago, of innate gifts or senses, that one magician might have, others might not have. I know that yourself, BJ, and other guests have spoken before about, seeing spirits, detecting spirits, scrying, establishing the presence of a spirit. And to that point, we do have another listener question for you from Michael J. And Michael J is asking, BJ, can familiars be seen on the astral plane?
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually recently was working on a blog post kind of talking about the idea of the astral plane and what that is, and how maybe we overuse the term to kind of refer to all spiritual planes as opposed to kind of the closest to the physical, which is kind of what the traditional astral is. It's sort of the spiritual light that surrounds the physical world and kind of the foundational plane that's kind of created by that spiritual light. Yeah, no, you could totally kind of move into an awareness of that astral space, and spirits who are working from various parts of the spirit world kind of filter through that astral space and working with us. And so, yes, that could be a place where it may be easier for you to perceive your familiar spirit or work with your familiar spirit. And I do talk some in the book about working with familiars in that capacity. You could also move into spaces that are more authentically part of the spirit world, like the world of the dead, the world of dreams, the world of fairies, the world of the gods. Like, those are all spaces that you could potentially push through the astral into as well, and work with the spirits directly in those spaces where they reside, in addition to working with them in kind of the waking world or the physical world. And I think sometimes we get really hung up on how we're perceiving the spirits, when sort of an awareness that the spirit is there, an awareness that the spirit's communicating with us, and the functionality of its ability to perform and do the things that we request of it are often the more important parts than just, are we able to see something that kind of knocks our socks off? I think a lot of times the magicians who kind of have more talk about their results will frequently say, like, yeah, you should have something happen that differentiates the space so you know that the spirit is there, or differentiates the experience of the spirit's there. That could be seeing the spirit, that could be hearing the spirit. It could also be just a different feel in the pressure of the room, or the temperature, or the way the air is moving. It could be something perceptible in sort of the energy of the room, or kind of the capacitance of the room. And then you feel the presence internally, you hear the voice of the spirit internally, in addition to that feeling. So we don't necessarily need to get hung up on the idea of a visible appearance or the idea of something that's physically present. I think last time I was on the show, I may have told the story about, I grabbed a talisman that was in my pocket and went to kind of apply its force, and forgot that a spirit related to the same range of powers was the last spirit that I had conjured. And its seal was still sitting under the crystal ball on a table across the room from where I was. And I reached in my pocket, grabbed the talisman to sort of activate its use in the situation that I'm in. And as soon as I do that, the crystal ball leaps from the table that is like 2-3 yards away at least, and rolls across the room and hits me in the foot.
Yes.
And so it's, oh, wow, like the very physical result of the presence of this spiritual power, saying like, yeah, like I'm still in the vicinity, and now you're using this power that's related to the series of forces that I kind of govern. So like sometimes you will have those very physical manifest things happen, but you don't have to have that. If you ask a spirit to make it rain because you are a gardener and it would make you happy if there was good weather for your garden to grow, and it rains the appropriate amount to help your garden grow, and you don't see the spirit, you don't hear the spirit talk to you, you just kind of feel that it's present, and you notice something change when you call upon it, and that it does the thing you ask for. That's what's important in the end. And I think we've had a lot of people who, for various reasons, sometimes about selling products and books and classes, have really hammered into us that we have to do these exact things in order to get this exact response where we see the spirit physically in front of us, when these people themselves are also scrying the spirits. There's become a culture around that where when you look at what's actually in the medieval and the early modern books, that's not really reflected in there at all.
And speaking of those relationships, we have another listener question for you from Vajra Magnet, who is asking, BJ, what is the most meaningful interaction with a familiar that you've had?
As a teenager, had a spirit placed in my care sort of for me to learn to interact with them in a certain way, and for the spirit to learn and develop in a certain way. And I requested that it do something, and it did something, and that something went pretty wrong. And I think it was kind of jarring both for me and for the familiar. And I think that was kind of meaningful in the sense of like kind of thinking about how that's an element of magic, that when we apply a particular force or power in a particular way, then we have to think about the nature of that force and that power. We have to think about what guidance is being given to how it's being applied sometimes. Or it can do the thing that we want, but the thing that we want might not quite be the way that we want it. And I think like we have those horror stories that people tell, like, oh, magic is like a monkey's paw, and you ask for money and like your favorite aunt dies and leaves it to you. And it's like, yeah, most of the time that's not what happens. Like, there's various elements of how magic works that make that very unlikely, but it's not impossible. And there are times where we might call upon certain spirits and we don't think about what their nature is or what their goals are or the other powers that they end up being called for frequently, and how those things can come into play with whatever our request is if our request isn't guided properly. And so I think that was an initial lesson in that. It's a lesson that has had to come up a few times in my life. And I think for anyone who's pretty active in magic, it's a lesson that comes up a handful of times at least, and is an important lesson. I'm assuming the listener probably wanted something more along the lines of like kind of what were some cool or interesting interactions with familiars that really kind of show that the interaction is there. I would say for two of those, the current familiars that I work with, I received in a public ritual where people were able to go into an area and interact with the witch's devil and receive a familiar spirit by making a pact with the witch's devil. So I received two familiar spirits in the context of that ritual, and they're the ones that I currently work with. And during the ritual, right after I received my spirits and we were kind of moving into the next phase of the ritual, the space next to our space where we were hosting the ritual had a musician in it, and he started playing some music loudly, like not like performing, but just playing his radio. But happened sometimes. Like this was at William Blake Lodge, and so sometimes we'd be doing the Gnostic Mass, and then suddenly there'd be like music playing from the next apartment, and it was like, what's going on? Well, maybe this fits, maybe it doesn't. Oh well, this happens. But in this case, I was kind of like, I really do not want this happening. And so I turned to the familiar and asked it to go end that situation. And within a couple seconds, just like in the middle of a song, the music cut out and didn't start up again through the rest of the ritual. And so that was pretty cool because it was kind of like, all right, like I just went back and kind of communed with this spiritual force and received these names and these signs for these familiars and kind of a vision of what they look like. And is this real? Is this just in my head? Is this just something that I'm convincing myself of because I'm in this ritual context? Or are these spirits here and can they do things? And so immediately I asked for a very material thing from the spirit, and it performed that very material thing. And that was pretty cool. Another weird instance that I think I talked about in the book, if not, I probably talked about it in the panel discussion about William Blake Lodge's familiar, when things were kind of going through the drama that the lodge went through related to the familiar. And there was kind of a question about whether or not things could end up being dissolved at the lodge. It occurred to me that it would make sense to release the familiar if that happened. And so I started thinking about how we would go about that. And I was like, well, I guess we would smash the skull that had the blood seal on it, and maybe smash the jar that had the blood seals on it in order to bind it to that space. And by destroying those, that should release it. And a few days after I had considered that as a possibility, and I didn't talk with anyone about it, one of the lodge officers, who was one of the two people who primarily was responsible for the care of the spirit, reached out and was like, yeah, he's really afraid that they're going to send someone to smash his jar and smash his skull. And he really does not want that to happen. And so we need to do whatever we need to do in order to protect him from that happening and make sure no one has access to do that if it comes down to that. And I was like, whoa, wait, he's afraid of what? And I'm like, no. I don't think anyone's coming to do that. That was a plan that I had for freeing him, but I guess I was wrong. That is not the method for doing that, which illustrates that for all of us, this is kind of experimental sometimes, because I was thinking that would be how you solve that situation, and the spirit told someone else, under no circumstances do that. But it was also interesting because it was something where I was contemplating this as an interaction with the spirit, and the spirit went to someone else that it had a more intimate communication with and was like, make sure BJ knows not to do this.
Is there anything else, any misconceptions that you'd like to break further about familiar spirits, or anything else in the book, or anything else in general? Any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave listeners with?
The big one that we only kind of tangentially touched in this is, no matter how cute your cat is not your familiar. That's something that people very tongue-in-cheek used to kind of say through like the 80s and 90s, like calling their pets their familiars, but it grew to the point where there were a few books that kind of talked about pets as familiars, and it's a very common thing to see in a lot of witchcraft and magic forums, and even some pretty serious magicians will kind of refer to their pet as a familiar, but I think usually in a tongue-in-cheek fashion when it's the more serious magicians, hopefully in a tongue-in-cheek fashion. But that was never what was going on in history, in magic. It was spirits always. And so I think that's an important misconception to make sure people are aware of. I doubt your listener base is going to be super confused on that, but hopefully your listener base is broad enough that it has some people who would be. So make sure to note that. I guess other things in magic to think about, it's just that, again, the things that we deal with in magic are things that are real, and the spirits that we deal with are beings that are real, and they are people. They are not things that are abstractifications or archetypes or things that are just there to do the things that we want. They have their own goals, their own needs, their own desires, their own natures. And so when I say they are people, I don't necessarily mean that they are dead humans. Like, I'm not a spiritist where there's the interpretation that all spirits are just dead humans. They're people in the sense that they are individual beings, and they're beings that we have to interact with in ways that make sense for the type of being that they are, and for their natures and for our needs, but also their needs. That our interaction with them, Jason Miller calls it a negotiated space. I call it a nexus point. But it is a sharing between us and them, and the physical space of the world around us, the divinity in the world around us, the spiritual powers of the moment of time in which the conjuration is happening, and the spiritual powers that make up that physical place where it's happening. And those things all come together and sort of bleed into each other to create a sort of special type of moment or existence where we are able to work with these spirits and interact with these spirits, and they're able to work with and interact with us in a way that is sometimes more full and direct than what we have just in regular interactions outside of those ritual contexts and ritual spaces. That doesn't mean that interactions don't happen outside of those ritual contexts and those ritual spaces, but when we start to think of them as real, and we start to think of the magic as real and the things that we're doing as real, then they have meaning, and there's meaning behind what we're doing and the reasons why we're doing it, and behind the ideas and the interpretations of the things that we're engaging with. And when we take that reality and put that in the forefront of what we're doing, it opens up a much broader and bigger world for us and allows us to create structures where we can more fully think about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it and make it more effective when we kind of let go of that sense of reality and try and look at everything as being about us or being about what we want or how we want to interpret things. Then it all becomes really, really easy, but much less effective. And I think that's a big part of this type of exploration, is by working with familiars and looking at these familiars, we're putting ourselves in a space where there's an immediacy, there's an imminence to the interaction with these spirits. So we have to address that reality. We have to immerse ourselves within it in a way that allows us to then think about how we immerse ourselves in that reality in the rest of our lives, the rest of our world, and the rest of our interaction with the animistic existence that makes up our environment.
Definitely listeners will check out below, but how else, BJ, aside from, of course, picking up a copy of your latest tome, can they support your work? Can you share a little bit about your social media, a little bit about your blog, and also just maybe give us some hints on any future projects or topics that you are working on or thinking about right now?
Well, as I say on a lot of these interviews, I'm pretty bad at social media and pretty bad at marketing. So I'm mostly on Facebook because I am a geriatric millennial and Facebook was made for us. And so,
touche.
Yeah, that's the easiest place to find me. I have an author page on Facebook, BJ Swain, author. And I have the blog page for Glory of the Stars there, as well as my individual profile. And any of those are options for finding me and my work. I am one of the organizers for the forum on Facebook, Living Spirits, which my book, Living Spirits, is actually named after the forum. I did not name the forum after the book. The forum came first. It's a really nice forum, not super active, but the activity that goes on there is really good. And it's a place where I will frequently announce things. So people who are interested in stuff that I'm doing, as well as stuff that some other really great magicians and really great authors and teachers are doing, that's a great place to get information on that. I have some classes available for purchase on Ko-Fi.com. I will eventually have more of those available. Otherwise, I have a lot of free classes on my website, The Unveiled Sky, and on my YouTube channel. I like to make sure I'm putting out lots of free material for people. And so there's a lot of stuff on my blog, on my website, on my YouTube channel that is out there for people and is accessible. Right now, I'm working on expanding some of that, trying to do more stuff, more content for YouTube, and trying to pre-write a bunch of blog posts, because as I get deep into book work, then it's really hard to stay on top of the blogs and the other media. As far as upcoming book projects, this is going to be the first place that I publicly talk about this. I'm going to make an announcement on my blog at some point as well. I had announced several books that I was working on back about a year ago, and all of them were pretty well underway. And there were some that I was very excited about and were pretty interesting topics. Unfortunately, I switched from working at home to working in my office at the athletic facility where I teach. And we had someone who left a door unlocked. And so both my work laptop and my personal laptop were stolen. So I'm in the process of going through and assessing what things I have backups of and still have. But there may be some books that I was in the middle of writing that are just lost at this point. Right now, I am focusing my attention on Breathing Magic, which is the direct sequel to Living Spirits, and is going to be, whereas Living Spirits was primarily theory and ideas and kind of looking at a spirit ecology and kind of mapping out the spirit world, with a focus, obviously, on spirits from kind of European modalities, not broadly the rest of the world, since that's the area where I have enough expertise to talk about them. Breathing Magic is going to be taking those same ideas, those same spirits, and looking at how to ensorcel your life through a series of exercises, activities, ritual practices, ideas for magical work that you can do, and kind of building up a structure for magic in your life in order to immerse yourself in that spirit world. It will have some theory and ideas in it, but it's really going to focus on the practical elements of it. And so my goal is to have that out by the end of the year. I was working on the book on witch blood, kind of looking at the historical idea of witchcraft and how to create that witching nature in yourself if it's not something you were born with, or how to further empower it if it was something you were born with. And I do actually have a manuscript that's completed of that, which a couple other people have looked at, but have decided that I want to expand it with more material on history and on living cultures and magical practices and ideas that exist in other cultures that illustrate the same ideas that are being talked about, as well as looking at some historical examples in European culture that illustrate the ideas talked about in the book. And that's something where I was really deep into a lot of academic research and have unfortunately lost that research and the notes for that research. So I'm going to have to rebuild that. So I'm putting that project on hold because the goal was kind of a mid-year release for that with Breathing Magic to wrap up the year. And I'm going to focus on Breathing Magic for now. And then from there, kind of assessing what other projects I want to work on. I have one on some experimental methods for working with the fair folk, and I'm kind of using that as a sort of secondary project to work on when I want to work on something other than Breathing Magic. And then one of the texts that I've announced working on is one on kind of working with the Abramelin squares and kind of building a goetic practice around journey work and descending into the underworld spaces where the demons reside and working with them on their turf and using the Abramelin squares to kind of guide that work. That text is mostly written, and that I do have still. And so that's something that once I'm finished with Breathing Magic, I'll probably be returning to that and kind of looking at what other work I still have to kind of wrap up on some of the texts that I was working on. But there'll be further announcements on that once I kind of have more of my bearings as far as what's coming out. But hopefully for December, sequel to Living Spirits.
Woe be unto the person or persons who would make the horrible decision to even think of absconding with your research and your writing material. So sorry to hear that, but also so excited about your upcoming projects, hopefully coming out, as you say, by the end of the year, in addition to everything else that you just shared that you're working on. I mean, we are definitely going to be, I know, keeping our ear to the ground for your upcoming works, your upcoming research. And of course, listeners, make sure to check out the podcast and video descriptions below, not only to check out BJ's works and support BJ, but also for BJ's blog posts and social media, everything else. Author and magician, his latest tome is Familiar Unto Me, Witches, Sorcerers, and Their Spirit Companions. BJ Swain. BJ, just thank you so much just for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This is it's a great experience to be on.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I really hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, because BJ adds this wonderful context, both in the broad strokes with the history and the very diverse and wonderful ways that familiar spirits are approached throughout the world, but also in very specific and very practical ways for you to engage with familiar spirits. So definitely check out the links below to pick up a copy of your own of BJ's book. And as well, thank you so much to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on patreon.com/glitchbottle. If you are listening to this right now and you have not become a member of Glitch Bottle, and if you are willing to subject yourself to intense amounts of nerdiness and back and forth discussion, head on over to patreon.com/glitchbottle with exclusive perks, and I cannot wait to see you there. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.